Hello, everyone. So talking about culture, I'm going to use this word like 100 times during the next 30 minutes, so you know it's important after the session. And it's not going to be kind of super practical, because when we are touching culture, it's very contextual. But I want to tell you why it is important and how to tackle the culture in your own contexts. So let me start with that. Junk Odor in 1995, basing on his research, said that about 70% of all major change programs fail. And by that time, it was no new news. It was the same for quite some time. 20 years later, we are here, 20 years later, and if you look at the research around success rates of change programs, it hasn't moved a bit. It's the same for more than 40 years already. We are failing 70 to 90% of times. Now, there is one interesting perspective to those statistics. For the past 15 years, we've seen a huge rise of agile and lean approaches that directly aim to improve the way we work, to change the way we work, and they don't seem to have impact on those numbers at all. Now, there is obviously a question why, and my answer to that question would be that we focus too much on practices, tools, techniques, methods. We are looking for recipes. I mean, this is my experience from ACE conferences over years. We would frequently talk about, okay, so give me a recipe how I should change my team. Well, doesn't work. What we should be paying more attention to is what's beyond practices. What is the mindset of people who are adapting a change? What are the principles they follow? What are the values that they share? And when I'm talking about mindsets, values, principles, I cannot help but bring organizational culture to discussion. So we define organizational culture as a sum of behaviors of people within an organization. And not only behaviors, but also what drives those behaviors. So we would have visions, values, beliefs, norms, systems. So anything that forms those behaviors, those everyday behaviors. Now, when we are talking about culture versus practices, there is a very interesting experiment that I ran recently. During Kanban Leadership Retreat, I ran a workshop. By the way, Kanban Leadership Retreat is an event where once a year, leaders of global Lean Kanban community would go to discuss the state of the tools we have to try to improve those. So I ran there a workshop around failed changes and why we fail with those change programs. And this is the end result of that workshop. So whatever you see on that picture, and it's more to the left, it's more related to culture. If it's more to the right, it's more related to practice. Now, this picture has two parts. The top part are root causes of failures. So we started with failure stories, then we tried to find why we failed. And then we distributed those sticky notes on the scale. So any sticky note that is more to the left, it's like, it tells a story like, we lack the proper culture. Any that is more to the right, it says a story like, we lack the proper practices. Now, the bottom part is about solutions. So knowing what failed, we try to find solutions for those issues. And again, more to the left, it's more about addressing the cultural problem. More to the right, it's addressing more the problem of practices. Now, I see a problem here. This picture is heavy on those two areas, which basically tells us that we understand that the majority of issues that make our change programs fail are related to culture. At the same time, majority of tools and solutions that we have, it's all about practices. I see slight imbalance here. And let me tell that it's not a result of a group of random agile coaches. These are people who are pushing the envelope of global Lean Kanban community that has evolutionary change painted on its banners in a big font. So there is a huge problem here. Now, when we are talking about culture, probably sooner or later this thing would pop up, which is culture hacking. And I consider that a dangerous thing, because the way it is most frequently understood is like, let's change something here and see what happens. The way we hack some code. Now, the difference is, you're not playing with code here. You're playing with humans, with their beliefs, with their behaviors. And there's no rollback. If you change people's behavior, there's frequently no going back to the old way of how they were behaving. So it's very risky. I much prefer a more structured approach, which is PDCA cycle, for example. PDCA comes from plan, do, check, act. So the plan part is defining a hypothesis. If I change something, I expect some sort of result. Now, it's not only defining a hypothesis, it's also defining how we are going to measure whether that hypothesis is right or wrong. So how we are going, when and how we are going to tell whether the experiment worked or didn't. So only then we implement the actual experiment, and then we check its results, and then we act on those results, designing the next experiment, because it goes one after the other. Now, important part is not really learning that the experiment or our hypothesis was proved or disproved. The important part is understanding. What's changing in our organization, how we can act with our organization, how we can influence that change. And by the way, the same thing is true for practices. So this is another outcome of Canva Leadership Retreat, which is basically distilling some of the ideas that were connected, which basically says that if we understand the practices we use, we will learn. If we apply them in kind of mindless way, we risk that we will end up in doing some sort of cargo cult. So let me use an example to explain that. It's morning. You need some physical exercises. So please stand up. Everyone who does stand-ups, some sort of stand-ups in your team. I would assume that most of you will stand up. Yes, stand-ups are the most prevalent agile practice. Now, keep standing, don't sit down, keep standing. If you ask yourself and your teams explicitly, why you are doing stand-ups, what kind of value you are getting from stand-ups. Keep standing if you had this discussion with your team explicitly. It's nothing bad. Okay, the rest of you, keep standing if you ask yourself and your teams explicitly, what value you're supposed to get from stand-ups. Why stand-ups were initially a part of Scrum and other agile methods. You've had this discussion with your teams. Keep standing if you did. If not, please sit down. Thank you. Now, that's interesting. Thank you. Now, that's interesting. It seems that majority of you doing those practices don't really pay attention to understand how they are working and why they are working. In other words, you're risking that you will end up doing cargo cult. And most famous example of cargo cult is from Pacific Islands. So during the Second World War, Americans would come, they built military bases, they would bring airplanes, ships, they would bring all sorts of cargo like food, weapons, clothes. Some of that they shared with the natives. Now, the war was over, Americans were gone, but the natives still wanted, all those supplies. So they figured out that if they copy all the practices that the Americans did, cargo would come. So they built airstrips, air control towers, airplanes, everything out of wood, by the way. And they were hoping that, cargo would come. Guess how did it work for them? It didn't. And if you don't try to understand the practices you use, and I just used one example, you're risking the same fate. Now, let's go back to organizational culture for a bit. If you want to influence how people use different practices, you need to work with their beliefs, which is basically part of organizational culture. Now, If you want to change organizational culture, what would you do? I mean, organizational culture is a sum of behaviors, which means that you cannot just mandate a change of organizational culture. I mean, you can say, okay, from today we are a learning organization. How does it work? Doesn't. There is another bad news, actually, because we cannot mandate the change of behaviors either. I mean, you can introduce a policeman, you can introduce an agile coach who will just keep taking care that you are doing the right stuff. And then policeman is gone, and what do? You go back to the old way of doing things. So how can you influence the cultural change? Well, you can work on the constraints. What kind of constraints? Well, what is allowed? What is not allowed? What is encouraged? What is discouraged? What is rewarded? What is punished? What are the structures? What are the hierarchies? And by the way, when you're answering those questions, well, what are the rules? And then, what is acceptable? How far I can go breaking the rules before I get burned? Because if all of your rules are carved in stone, influencing the organizational change would be very, very difficult. So what kind of constraints we can work on? We have values, visions, symbols, for example. Let's start with those. So we have values. Every organization, every company has some values. They claim to care about all sorts of good stuff. And those values would frequently end up in stuff like mission statements or visions. So another exercise, another experiment. Please stand up everyone who works for a company that has one of those. Most companies do. I know at least one that doesn't. The one I work for. Cool. Now, keep standing, don't sit down. If you can quote that mission statement from the top of your head. 1, 2, 3. That's all. 4, 5. Thank you. 6. You are awesome. Now, I see a huge problem here. You don't seem to give a damn about the values of your companies. You cannot even, quote all those nice things where those values are written down. But you know what? It doesn't really matter. We will be back into that in a minute. Now, let's look at some values. This is a nice cloud of values that we can use. There are some of those that would be very common across different organizations. So customer satisfaction, high quality, people. Let's pick those 3. Which company wouldn't claim that they care about customer satisfaction, high quality, and people? Well, let's check. Please stand up everyone who works for a company that claims to care about customer satisfaction, high quality, and people. If someone is not standing, well, it may be weird, but what would I know? Okay, now keep standing, don't sit down, if the leaders and managers in your organization consistently act every day in a way that shows that they do care about high quality, customer satisfaction, and people. Consistently act every day. Now, be brave. Cameras are directed here, except of that one. Okay, thank you. Now, not only you don't give a damn about the values written down in your mission statements, but a big part of you actually disagrees with claimed values presented by your company. I see a huge problem with authenticity here. Those values that your companies claim to have? No, these are not values. Remember that? Organizational culture, sum of behaviors, not sum of words in a mission statement. Different thing. So organizational culture, values that are valued by your company would be represented by the behaviors, everyday behaviors of people in that company. Now, you may ask yourself question, what kind of values are represented by those behaviors? And I will leave you with that thought. Now, another constraint that we can work on, and system thinkers would probably disagree with me, are people. I mean, organizational culture, some of behaviors. Behaviors of whom? Of people. Now, when we are talking about people, we hire people, we build our teams. So when I'm talking about the culture, about people and hiring, well, I cannot help but mention hiring for cultural fit. Now, this concept is frequently misunderstood. This concept is frequently understood as, let's hire people who we get on well with. Let's hire people who it feels good to when we talk with them. That's just a bad idea, because we get on well with people who are similar to us. If we hire such people, we will end up with very uniform culture, which means that our teams won't be very creative, won't be very effective in terms of dealing with complex solutions. That's not exactly something we want to achieve. So the way we approach hiring for cultural fit in Lunar Logic is we look for people who are within some sort of general canon, cultural canon for a company. But at the same time, they are as different from everyone else as possible. So let me give you an example. If you ask me, would it be very likely that we will hire an Indian to Lunar? Unlikely. I think that in the majority of cases, there would be too big cultural difference, and hiring such a person would be more a disruption for a culture than augmentation of our culture. At the same time, whenever we are talking with candidates, we are looking for different characters, different passions, different interests, because this is what adds to our culture. But at the same time, we want them not to disrupt the way we work already. Because we want to avoid groupthink. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that basically makes teams or groups of people work to achieve very fast, very quick consensus, or to act for conformity. So if you have that, you get a penalty on creativity, you get a penalty on effectiveness. So we don't want to do that. We want to avoid that. Now, another problem with hiring is that we tend to hire super freaking heroes. I mean, we look for individuals that are extremely skilled, extremely intelligent. This is a perfect candidate. Now, the problem is that those guys don't work alone, even if they're introverts. They end up working as a part of a team. Now, we should be paying more attention to how they would help a team to become more effective. And there's research around that. Which is the research that says that there is this thing called collective intelligence that is much more predictive in terms of how a team would succeed with accomplishing complex tasks than individual intelligence would be. And we don't pay attention. I'm happy to discuss that later during the event, like what makes teams collectively intelligent. But it's not individual. These are not the traits that we typically pay attention to. And by the way, this research shows that the more women we have in our teams, the better the collective intelligence. And it's not about having a woman in a team. It's about having as many of them as possible. And again, I'm happy to propose an open space session on that if you want to discuss that in extent. Now, another constraint that we can work on is leadership. And I'm not talking about leadership as meaning a position of a leader, because for that we have another word, which is a manager. I'm talking about leadership as the act of leading people. In fact, not only the act of leading people, but also opportunity to lead. I mean, if I'm a line worker, a developer, a tester, whoever, do I have opportunities to lead teams, other people? Now, in most companies, leadership would be organized in this kind of way. The leadership would be organized in very structured, very hierarchical manner. Leadership opportunities would be assigned to positions of managers, so they would have power to lead. Now, let me run one more experiment with you. And you were like standing up and sitting down for quite some time, so this is going to be a thought experiment, so no physical exercise required. Ask yourself a question. What would happen if in your company now all the hierarchies, all the structures would disappear? Everyone would be peer to everyone else. Now, obviously, your companies wouldn't extinct overnight, so something would happen. Would there be hierarchies? I would say yes. Even if there are no formal structures, some hierarchies, some structures would emerge. Now, what kind of structures would emerge depends on what kind of culture you have in your organization. So if the constraints that form that organizational culture are reasonable, if values and principles are healthy, those structures should be healthy as well. If they are dysfunctional, well, you may recreate whatever you have right now. So, in other words, the answer to that question that I asked you may give you some insight what kind of values, what kind of principles your company follows. Now, I asked you to do that thought experiment, which was basically flirting with no management. No management is this idea that a company doesn't need managers at all to be run. And there are examples of such companies. In IT industry, it would be Valve, the guys that do games, or GitHub. You probably know this one. From other industries, Semco, Morningstar, W.L. Gore, guys that created Gore-Tex. You definitely know what Gore-Tex is. They don't have managers at all. It doesn't mean that they don't have hierarchies. It means that their hierarchies are emergent. In other words, they have to care about the culture, otherwise those organizations would quickly become dysfunctional. Now, this is important because the more you are towards no management out of scale, and this is a scale, by the way, it's not a binary choice. We either do have managers or we don't. It's a scale between very rigid, very structured, very hierarchical structures and no management. You can be anywhere. And the closer you are to no management and of scale, the better the distribution of leadership is. The more opportunities for everyone to take over leadership and do that. And you want to be closer because the closer you are to that end of scale, the more empowered people are. And I hate that word. It's so bloated. It's like, I empower you to bring me a beer. Thank you. But this serves as a proxy here for how much opportunities people have to take over leadership, how much power they have to change the part of the organization that is around them. Whether they can do the right thing when they know what the right thing is. Now, obviously, the culture, especially when we are talking about those cultures that are closer to no management, is difficult to scale. I mean, it's easy to have no managers when there are three of us. It's not that easy when there are 30 of us. It gets pretty damn hard when there are 300 of us, and I don't even know how it works when there are 3,000 of us. Now, at the same time, I consider growth as something that is so common, but shouldn't be. I mean, for pretty much any organization out there, any company out there, growth, scaling up is one of their goals. Should it be? I mean, growth is not only a risk for those kind of very emergent structures, not only for cultures that are closer to this no management and of scale. It's also a risk for any culture. Whenever I hear a company that claims, oh, we want to grow by 100% in a year, I'm like, are you sure? Because in a year, if you succeed in a year, you will have a very, very different company, a very, very different culture. Because if you hire like crazy, which means like 100% in a year is like hiring like crazy, basically controlling how the culture evolves and where it evolves is almost impossible. If you grow slow, you can use the time to get people to know the culture, to learn the culture of your company. So there is not that much risk of changing them in random direction. If you hire people like crazy, well, sorry. Now, for those of you who are working for big organizations, and I know that there is quite a bunch of you here, there is a hope as well. Everything that I said about the organizational culture, I was addressing to the culture of the whole company. But there is this idea of culture pockets. A culture that can exist within a bigger culture that may be very different. And these kind of things happen either when a part of company works in isolation, I mean, a branch in a different country, a branch in a different city, or a team in a different office. But these things happen also when there is a strong leader that can create for their team, they can create a bit different environment. And it may be, this culture pocket may be better, whatever better means in this context, may be better than the culture of the whole organization or worse. So think an asshole boss. He can create hell for their own team, even though the rest of the organization can be pretty healthy. So the same is true even in a, all I said is true even in a smaller context. Except culture pockets tend to be not that sustainable as cultures of the whole organization, because it's enough that few people are gone and culture pocket disappears. It's enough that we have a reorganization and a culture pocket disappears. Now, what I tried to do with this session, I tried to explain what is organizational culture, why it is important for every company, why understanding the existing culture may help you understand why so many of change initiatives fail. Why some of them are doomed to failure from day one because they are not aligned with whatever is existing culture of a company. Understanding organizational culture in your own context will also help you to become a better leader. And last but not least, understanding your culture around you and understanding what you personally expect from a company may help you to realize that in your current organization, you won't be able to pursue your goals, and it may be a good time to move. Thank you.